Okay, so we are in the idea that biblical law takes a lot of precautions to avoid violence in various situations and also in family relations as well. One of the worst plagues of our world today that has been on the rise globally and especially in the last few years is the issue of domestic violence. And the pandemic now and the extensive lockdowns have contributed significantly to this increase. And the same is true for Egypt, actually. I know for Greece that in the last 7 months there have been 7 killings of spouses against of wives by their spouses. So it's something that is really serious and it's growing and it's very concerning to the world in general. But also the same is true for Egypt, and we have reports now showing even 33% increase in domestic violence since the restrictions for COVID have started. Even though, according to the Egyptian constitution of 2014, violence against women is mentioned in Article 11. It says the state shall protect women against all forms of violence and ensure enabling women to strike a balance between family duties and work requirements. However, if any complaints manage to make it and get reported to the police, the woman has to show physical signs of abuse in order to make a case. However, the perpetrator is often pardoned if the judge decides that he acted in good faith, which is regarded as the husband's right to discipline his wife. Now, UNICEF has defined domestic violence as violence perpetrated by intimate partners and other family members, and is manifested through various forms: physical abuse, traditional harmful practices such as female genital mutilation, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, and economic abuse. For some of these, no physical signs are visible. A large percentage of domestic violence is often caused by pathological expressions of jealousy by a husband towards his wife. Acknowledging this reality and the extremely powerful hold that feelings of jealousy can have over a husband, the law devises a way that takes a husband's feelings seriously and takes the possibility of the dissolution of marriage because of this very seriously as well. Now, while the husband may be worried that he is defiling himself by staying with his wife and by uniting with an adulteress, the real danger here that the Bible sees, I believe, is the life and well-being of the wife. Under these circumstances of a household with a jealous husband, there exists a real possibility of the wife being either subjected to the death penalty for adultery on the basis of ungrounded accusations that the husband could bring to court, or the possibility of the husband treating his wife violently to force her to a confession, or even killing her himself under the influence of his uncontrollable jealous fury. There's also the possibility of divorce, according to Deuteronomy 24, which would be just as detrimental for the well-being of the woman, since that would fuel speculations from the community about the grounds of divorce. Maybe she's an adulteress and that's why he, let her go. So this would make it really hard for the woman to remarry. Also, divorce does not appease a jealous husband. Today, numerous killings are carried out by jealous ex-husbands. But we have a law, the law in Numbers 5:11-31, which devises an elaborate ritual that could bring the husband's suspicions to a resolution. He is to bring his wife to the temple where the priest will have her drink bitter water. The case taken as an example here is probably one where the woman is pregnant and the husband is unsure whether the child is his. Upon drinking this water that carries a curse, presumably, she will miscarry if guilty. Otherwise, she will be able to give birth. Now, in other cultures of the time, people practiced the so-called river ordeal. Now, what is this? The woman suspected of adultery in those cases would be thrown into the river, and if she drowned, she would be declared guilty. If she managed to survive, then she was innocent. Now, this, however, is something that depended a little bit on the woman's ability to swim, or to the choice of current that you would choose to throw her in, how weak or strong was it. So some sort of control over the woman's fate still remains with human agency in these cases. In the biblical ritual, however, the water the wife is supposed to drink is not a poison. The recipe is fixed, so one could not manipulate the solution. It's simply water from the temple in a clay jar, which keeps water clean, usually, with some dust from the ground and some traces of ink, perhaps, from the scroll of the curses. Now, worst case scenario would be for the woman to get a stomach ache. The actual miracle would be for this solution to be seriously detrimental to the health of the woman, in which case divine intervention would be unquestionable to all witnesses. What this magical-looking ritual communicates is that a decision on a case where only God is the witness must be handed over entirely to him, so that peace may return to the household. Frankly, it is doubtful that this water mixture ever brought about anything more than a mild indigestion. But this is the whole point. It is a handing over of the husband's anxiety to the righteous judge. Now, the law is not implementing a sentence on the woman. The priests have no authority to decide her guilt or her innocence. It is not a court case, this ritual. What this ritual deals with is the jealousy of the husband and his claim that he's defiled by remaining in union with her. Now, even the offering that they're bringing to the temple is called offering of jealousy. It's not an offering for atonement. The ritual brings the husband's emotions to a resolution, because even though the woman may not be an adulteress in reality, in his mind and in his imagination, she is, and he cannot be freed from this paranoia apart from a ritual process that helps him out of it. Finally, this ritual removes from the husband any justification of slander against his wife, psychological and physical violence towards her, her expulsion by divorce, and surely her murder. I believe that this law guards against domestic violence. And as Hannah Lees, another Old Testament scholar, argues, it offers a means of reuniting the couple. Now, having seen numerous Old Testament texts that oppose or restrict violence, and you see that on the surface, we cannot see what the function of this weird ritual is. But it had a social function, which was very important, and it protected the weak among Israel. So if we read superficially, we may misinterpret the Old Testament. But if we really dig in, and if we compare it to other rituals like the river ordeal, for example, we will see how more humane this thing is. So having seen numerous Old Testament texts that oppose or restrict violence, and remembering, of course, the foundational story of creation, where violence is absent, as we said, theomahy is absent, and the world is brought about solely by God's word, we may now approach the problem of war in the Old Testament, not as the normal biblical pattern, but as a deviation from what the Bible promotes. Now, the problem, when we come to the topic of war in the Old Testament, Christians often feel very uncomfortable, and they either avoid the discussion altogether, or they resort to two main reactions. One is that they attempt unapologetic to defend war and excuse Yahweh. This is what is called theodicy. It's justifying God, theos and diki, which is and dikio, which is justice, so justifying God in a sense. And the second position is to partly agree actually with the neo-atheists and defend Jesus as the one who corrected the bloodthirsty tendencies of the Old Testament Yahweh. Now, the first position, you would think, yes, we should defend our faith, find an apologetic for what is going on in Scripture. But sometimes this position, it tends to suppress the human instinct that cries out against the pain and the death of the other. Indeed, this instinct should not be silenced. If we are uncomfortable with war, we are uncomfortable with war, and we should be. Humans should never lose their empathy to human suffering, even the suffering of their own enemy. Also, we should not assume the role of God's defender. Okay, God can defend his own self. On the contrary, we are encouraged to dialogue or even bargain with God on various occasions. We may express our complaints and our disagreements with God. We have various examples. Abraham, he did not hesitate to confront Yahweh with respect to Sodom and Gomorrah. He felt there's an injustice here. He dared to raise his head and negotiate with God about what he considered to be just and fair, to be fitting for God. God honored his courage and the sense of justice that Abraham demonstrated. Even though he's God, he nevertheless desires to converse and is open to hear human objections. Even with Jonah's objections, we know the story of Jonah. He's a prophet who's getting a bad press. But even though his objections lacked mercy, God makes an effort of engaging with him and explaining to him the reasons he decided to act the way he did towards Nineveh. And not to mention Job, who thought of God as completely unjust in his judgment and did not hesitate to express it. But God, instead of striking Job with a lightning, he honors his objections. He praises even Job for keeping his sense of justice intact in Job 42:7. Also, we have numerous psalms that are asking why. There are objections. Why should our enemies oppress us? Why should the unjust people thrive? Why did you abandon your people? And many more like this. So God does not want you to suppress your sense of justice, even if that means that it brings you into confrontation with Yahweh. So an apologetic stance of theodicy, no matter how good our motives are for taking it, should not turn a blind eye to the serious and thorny issues before us. Remember the friends of Job. The friends of Job meant well, of course, in their efforts to justify God, to defend God. And what is the result? You end up blaming the victim. You end up making them a liar. You end up doubting their experience of pain. So even though they meant well in their efforts to defend God, they ended up not achieving anything. All they did was neglect the pain of their brother. At the same time, we do not want easy solutions that have not struggled with the enormity of our topic. The easiest thing would be to give up and make a quick judgment by saying, Yahweh is bad, and I will no longer bother with him. I'm just going to deal with Christ. Many people have this stance, actually, many believers, and they just give up too easily. Many people cannot carry the weight of unanswered questions. And I'm not saying this only for this lecture. You may have many unanswered questions about your life, about other theological topics, and there will be always unanswered questions. But when we have unanswered questions and we don't handle the way, we cannot carry the weight of unanswered questions, we simply abandon our faith. A friend of mine said that you do not abandon your house just because the roof is leaking. Which of us would leave our house just because there's a leak? We usually put a bucket underneath and see with time how we will fix it. But we not abandon our house. So it's the same with unanswered questions. However, there is a middle way that involves more struggle. Someone said, only the lunatics and the fanatics do not battle with doubts. It's not the believer who has no doubts. It's the fanatic, actually. And the person with no doubt is dangerous. It means they're so stringent, they cannot allow anything to change their position, anything to question their motives, nothing. They are fixed. And these people are actually dangerous. We should be doubting, and we should be doubting ourselves first. So, our relationship with God is not a slavish relationship. He's not a general who says something and we do not question, we just follow like robots. No, it's a relationship of struggle. This is, in fact, the name of God's people, Israel, which means the one who struggles with God himself. This comes from Genesis 32, 24 to 28. You remember the story when Jacob was left alone and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." He did not let God alone. He did not let him off the hook. This is the people of God. It's a people who struggle with their God. Even though Israel may get defeated and end up with a fractured hip, this relationship demonstrates how we are called to relate to him freely and honestly. So today we shall attempt to struggle with the data. I do not claim that I will solve this issue. This is beyond any single individual. But together we shall see at least what parameters need to be considered in approaching this question. So let's begin with war in the ancient Near East. We always speak about placing our study in its ancient context. So we must say a few words about war in the ancient Near East. And I have a very good friend, so more advertising here, my friend Charlie Trim. He has written a very thorough study of ancient warfare for anyone who wants to continue research in ancient warfare in the Old Testament. And he's soon publishing another book on the destruction of the Canaanites, which is very, very relevant for our talk today. I did not have a chance to look at it because it's not yet out. It's coming soon. But I know that he will show various positions that have been taken on this topic. So our aim today is to place the biblical texts we read in their own historical context to see how other nations were conducting war in the ancient Near East, so that we may understand a little bit what the people of Israel thought about these battles. Now, when did organized war start in antiquity? Organized war in the ancient Near East, and I do not mean simply fights or minor confrontations, but organized war. It historically begins with the settlement of people into towns, because that is the time when farming would begin. And that's the time when you need to defend things. Okay, so with farming, goods would be produced, and excesses, the things you do not consume yourself, needs to be stored and guarded. This excess of profit that you're storing contributes to social inequality, which meant that these goods were a major temptation for those who did not have access to such resources. For this reason, small armies were formed, small bands of robbers, etc., that would eye these things, and they would go and snatch them from the rich. These bands lived mainly in the mountains because you cannot farm mountainous regions. So they would live there. They also had more protection and ease to attack in hiding. So this is where normally these people would be found in the hill country. Now, a second reason for war was the possession of waters. So we saw the possession of goods, of farming, and now the possession of waters, because waters are needed for farming and for sustaining people and animals as well. So war was fought for the possession of waters, rivers, channels that would enable people to control and use them, but also to protect themselves against river floods. So they needed to have control over the rivers to avoid destructions of their cities, to build channels, to guard their properties. And these issues, as you very well know, never end. And you experience this threat now with your neighbors, the Ethiopians. So, yes, we will never get over these issues. Now we have a third reason, of which you also know. A third reason for war was the control of major trade routes and highways that would enable a nation's trade to continue without disruption. And with this you have experience as well, because you know how important the Suez Canal is and how much it was sought after throughout history. So these are the reasons of war from antiquity. Now, because of these dangers, these threats of other armies, walls started to be built around the cities. And initially, the walls were built around the cities to keep animals within the gates of the city and to protect the animals from wild beasts who would come from outside. But also to protect, as we said, the cities from rivers flooding. So you can see how technology and military organization grow together in the history of humanity. They develop simultaneously. Now, we must also consider the production of weapons, because for the production of weapons, we need the mining industry. The mining industry would increase, and of course, wars are fought over mines. Trade was very common, and especially with countries that mine special metals, and the possession of mines were extremely important so that people would produce the best weapons possible for their armies. Now, the one who begins a war the one who leads the war and goes ahead at the head of the army is always the king. The king is there. He's at the head. The king is the one who leads everyone else into battle. He wears his armor, and the victory is considered to be his own victory, the king's victory. However, the king, as you very well know from Egypt, is not acting on his own behalf. He's considered to be carrying out the will of the gods, of course. He's fighting for the gods. He's carrying out the battle of the gods. So the battle is not the decision of the king. It's not portrayed as the decision of the king. The battle is a divine decision. And the military weapons were not mere weapons that people carried, that people created. They were deified. They were sacred objects. They were almost deified and were used in religious ceremonies. And the god was believed to give his own weapon, that he gives his own weapon to the king in order for him to carry out his war. And we have a beautiful picture from Egypt, from the temple of Ramses III at Medinet Habu in Luxor. And you can see here the god Ammon, who's providing a divine weapon to the king to use in his battles, demonstrating the support of the gods for the king. Now, professional armies, as opposed to the battles conducted by all the men of the nation, so you know the battles that the tribes conducted in the period of the judges. There was no army in the period of the judges. It was all the men of all the tribes came together to fight, and that was it. It was still not developed. But professional armies, as opposed to the battles conducted by all the men of the nation, appears in the 2nd millennium BC. It was a bit later in Israel. It was around the time of David that professional armies were being formed. Now, often the financing of war, who financed these wars? The financing of wars was coming from the temples of the gods, of course. And in return, the loot that would be seized by the soldiers when they went out to battle would return back to the temple. So it was like a loan, in a sense, but with much bigger interest. Now, a census had to be taken of all the men who would join the army. And again, don't think in secular terms. Everything is sacred. The weapons are from the god. The census is a cultic. It's a cultic ritual. The people are initiated. They have to participate in a cultic meal if they are going to fight for the king and the god. And they commit themselves with oaths and magic in various situations. Now, of course, wars were religiously justified, meaning that the reasons given for the wars were that the enemy had sinned in one way or another against their opponent. For this reason, victory in war meant that justice was restored. It was not pure political wars that we know of them today, that we have separated the secular from the religious. There was no such separation then. So the gods were directly involved in these battles, and they are represented in numerous reliefs we have from antiquity as warriors with weapons in the midst of the battle. They're accompanying the king and walking beside him in battle. Or sometimes the god is riding with the king in the same chariot. So the gods are very much involved in the battle. This was the common understanding. It's not something we only see in the scriptures. And now we want to talk about the word that we are most interested in, called Harem. Now, this is a certain type of war in the ancient Near East. And it's commonly translated as anathema, It's Harem in Hebrew, but it means something that is handed over to the god. Anathema. Anatheto is the verb, which means I give, I hand over, I offer. Okay, so something is handed over. And if you offer something over to the god, usually if you offer a sacrifice, let's say, to the god, it means that it's wholly burned and it's received by the god. I don't consume anything of it. So somewhere in antiquity, the roots of this came from this religious language. Now, this means that it's not something that's handed over to God in life. It's something that's utterly destroyed. And in this way, it's offered to God. So, harem means something that is devoted to destruction. It's a word that describes the total destruction of the enemy's towns, and it's often done by fire. Now, the practice of harem is seen in the ancient Near East. It's not something unique to Israel. And we find it written in a certain stele called the Mesha stele. Mesha was the king of Moab. So this is a Moabite stele. It's a stele that is written by the king of Moab. It's not... it doesn't have something that's in the Bible. It's an extra biblical archaeological artifact. But we find the word harem in this inscription. Now, Mesha, the king of Moab, is telling us that after a long subjugation in the hands of Omri of Israel, so he's under Omri's occupation, he decides to take vengeance over Israel and effects harem on Israel, harem on them. So let's see what he's writing. And Chemosh, that's his god, said to me, "Go, take Nebo from Israel." And I went in the night, and I fought against it from daybreak until midday. And I took it, and I killed the whole population, 7,000 male subjects and aliens, and female subjects, aliens and servant girls. For I had put it to the ban, harem, for Ashtar Chemosh. And from there I took Yahweh's vessels, and I presented them before Chemosh's face. Now this is what Mesha is saying. Now there are some parallel features of harem in Moab and in Israel. One is that both the oppression of Moab by Israel as well as the victory of Moab over Israel are attributed to the god Chemosh. Okay, so you see the interpretation is all viewed through the lenses, through the eyes of the god. It's not his own decisions, independent decisions. Also, Chemosh is the one directing the attack by giving instructions such as, "Go, take Nebo from Israel." He's not doing it out of his own accord, Mesha. Now, these elements can also be said of the biblical record. Now, this is just one example that shows how this practice was not exclusive to Israel. Scholars hold that the origins of harem are very ancient, and they're found in the broader world of pagan antiquity, and they begin much earlier even than the Moabite stele that we have here and the biblical record. In the Bible, however, the first time we see harem, we see it in Exodus 22:20. And in Exodus, when we see it for the first time, it is not against another nation. It is in the context of Israelite law, which is primarily against Israel, not the nations. It says, "Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be devoted to destruction," shall be harem. Now, this is important because here we will see traces of what we will explain later and we will expand on later, the lack of discrimination of Yahweh between Israel and the nations. So harem, the Israel is subject to harem just as much as any other nation. Now, we spoke earlier about foundation stories, stories of beginning, but we need to come back to this for a reason. What we are most concerned with is the Harem instructions that are to be carried out in the Promised Land. Harem is mainly exclusive to the conquest, to the entrance into the land, because it is part of Israel's foundation story, or the establishment of the nation in the land. Now, the defeat of chaos prior to new creation, as we saw already, is a motif that is well known in the ancient Near East. And we have seen it earlier. We saw it in Enuma Elish. Now we have a very famous scholar called Mircea Eliade. And Mircea Eliade has argued about the necessity of founding the place one intends to live in. He says, if the world is to be lived in, it must be founded, and no world can come to birth in the chaos of the homogeneity and relativity of profane space. In other words, for any culture that Mircea Eliade has studied many cultures, for any culture, there is no cosmos, there is no world. You have to create the world you will live in. Because if everything is common and there's no sacred spot where your God is revealed, where your God tells you, this is the place that I'm dwelling, this is an ordered world, and you can live here safely, then you cannot live anywhere. This is the understanding of the ancient people. They have to create the world they're going to live in, and it has to be absent of chaos. So, profane space exists in chaos. Profane space is a place where ghosts exist, where demons exist, where foreigners associated with demons dwell. And it is not yet a cosmos. It is not an ordered place. I cannot call it a home. And we all know that when we want to build a home, we want to order it. We don't feel at home unless we put it in order. And we know, okay, this is where I sleep, this is where the bathroom is, this is how humans function. There is no cosmos if they don't order it. So the cosmos, it's not yet a cosmos, the profane space. It's not an ordered place. It's not a place where God will manifest himself, consecrated, and reside there among the people. And humans cannot reside without their God. There's no atheist in the ancient world. So you reside only where God is. Now, dwelling in a new place is, in fact, a sort of repetition of creation. This is what God was doing in creation, let's say. So, in order for me now to live in a land, I have to reenact a cosmogony. I have to reenact a creation. I have to reenact the transformation of chaos into a habitable creation by God himself. However, for some ancient societies, the settlement and establishing of this world was bloody. We remember the creation stories, how cosmogonies were happened without the shedding of blood of chaos. You cannot create something. So the primordial giants had to be slain. Now, the biblical harem may also be rooted in symbolic conceptions. Now, already in Deuteronomy 6, 10-12, the descriptions of the promised land are reminiscent of Eden. The way that the land is described as the Garden of Eden, as if a new creation is taking place. So the land is described as a prepared paradise, where Israel, without any effort of their own, would settle in and be in the presence of their God. So you remember in the garden, God also dwelt there. There was order. The land of Israel will be like a new Eden where we can dwell with God. His tabernacle, our tents, our buildings around him. So, this shows that the author already thinks of the promised land as some sort of new creation. Moreover, we have the association with primordial giants in Deuteronomy, where the former giants of the land are portrayed in this way. Who is living in the land? Og, for example. Og himself is portrayed as a giant, a dangerous giant. Remember the description of his iron bed that is so huge and it's kept somewhere for people to see. So this is how people are described who are already living there. So the conquest of the land has to get rid of these giants first. And we see in Deuteronomy 2, chapter 2, that the conquest of other lands by other respective nations are also described in the same way, that they also had to defeat giants in order to live in their own lands. This is all in Deuteronomy 2. So we see that the place, the land of Israel, is a place of chaos. Something else we must see now is that creation. Remember how creation was done. It was affected in the 6-day pattern. And we see the entrance to the land through Jericho now, this time. We see this entrance following the 6-day pattern, the same pattern. Let's look at the text of Joshua 6. Now Jericho was shut up inside and out because of the Israelites. No one came out and no one went in. The Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have handed Jericho over to you, along with its king and soldiers. You shall march around the city, all the warriors circling the city once. Thus you shall do for 6 days. With 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. On the 7th day, you shall march around the city 7 times, the priests blowing the trumpets. When they make a long blast with the ram's horn, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and all the people shall charge straight ahead." Now, you see that the same pattern of creation, 6 days, and the 7th day is the completion, is the day of rest. This is what happens again in the land. In 6 days, it is created, it is achieved, and on the 7th day, it is handed over to them. If then the promised land is viewed by the author as a second creation, then the entrance into the land has to be described in a way analogous to the taming of the chaotic waters of the abyss. Now, the defeat of the forces of chaos in such a brutal language may have been reserved for founding stories of the land. This is why we don't find Harem in other stories, because it's about creation. It's about the foundation of their cosmos. So it's reserved for the founding stories of the land, and this may be the reason why Harem, as a type of warfare, had not persisted in Israel's history. The texts of Deuteronomy 7 and 20, which is God's instructions for Harem, are designed in such a way to help make Harem a thing of the past, showing how it's a foundational thing. Beyond these texts, the language of Harem is not really used for wars in the Old Testament, but it is mainly reserved as a technical term for the sacrificial system alone, that is for offerings devoted to the Lord in the temple. Okay, so not only was this conceived to be the way in which people would create their cosmos, that is their new settlement, but it was also the way to demonstrate the superiority of their God over the forces of chaos that reside in the land. And in the case of Deuteronomy, the superiority of Yahweh over the gods of the nations, over the gods of the Canaanites. But we have a problem because, as we have already said, there was no war in the... no, I will say this later. Be patient. We have many scholars who confirm this idea of the involvement of God in the wars of the nations. And now we said that this is at stake. This is what will be performed. Not only the cosmos will be created, their habitation will be created, but it will be demonstrated that their God, who is fighting with Israel, is superior to the gods of the nations. Because any victory or loss of the people was the victory or loss of their patron god. This was the only means for a god to show his superiority over another in the ancient world. You could not just claim, my God is better than yours. He does this, 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 this. No. Does he fight in battle? Did you take over any other nation? Did you conquer anyone? Then you will prove to us that your God is superior to their God. So this is how gods demonstrated their superiority. Similarly, Carly Crouch, another Old Testament scholar, another book here, War and Ethics in the Ancient Near East, she explains that the triumph of the human agent is equally a triumph of the god or the gods. The demonstrations of power and authority enacted in the humiliation or execution of conquered enemies are demonstrations of the power and authority of the god as much as the power of the human. So now we come to this problem we have. Remember how we said that there is no theomachy in the creation accounts of Genesis? Meaning that the victory of Yahweh over any other power is never really at stake. That in monotheism, there is no real match for the sovereign God of the cosmos. Well, true, but in the scriptures, there is something else we must know. We must distinguish between the diachronic, the timeless truths that come through the canon, and the unfolding of history as those truths are taught, comprehended, and experienced by the people. If all that Israel has ever seen and known is a plurality of gods, if they have seen the might of the gods of Egypt, in their mind, the demonstration of God's superiority over other gods, such as the one experienced in the Exodus, was not necessarily convincing to remove from them this long established mindset that at some point, at some battle, other gods may be stronger. In fact, this is always the case subsequent to the Exodus. This issue was never resolved with the Israelites. So I want us to look at something now which is worthy of note. The fact that even after the entrance of Israel into the land, many Israelites were worshippers of other gods. They were still not convinced that their God is superior to others. They still needed to see tangible demonstrations of their God being superior to other gods. We see this clearly in the 24th chapter of the book of Joshua, where all the tribes are gathered by Joshua at Shechem to renew their covenant with Yahweh. Note that in this text, Joshua mentions the God of their ancestors. And by ancestors, we usually have in mind Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? He does not mention Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Which ancestors does he mention? He goes prior to Abraham. He goes to Terah and Nahor from Mesopotamia, who worshipped the gods of Ur. He says, and Joshua said to all the people, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, long ago your ancestors, Terah and his sons, Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates and served other gods. These are the gods of your ancestors. Okay, yes, our ancestors in Ur worshiped these other gods, but that doesn't mean we still do, right? But did Israel continue to worship these ancestral gods? Joshua's words further in this chapter indicate that the worship of these gods continued in Egypt as well. Now, therefore, revere the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your ancestors served beyond the river Euphrates in Ur and in Egypt. So they brought them in. They brought them into Egypt and served the Lord. They're in the land. They experienced the Exodus. They experienced the wilderness. They experienced Sinai. They experienced Jericho. They're at the end of the book of Joshua, and they're carrying with them the gods of war. Not only this, but there's indications that Israel had already adopted and were worshiping the gods of the land in which they had just entered. Now, if you're unwilling to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you're living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. So it was still a debate. And then he said, then put away the foreign gods that are among you. So they already put them among them. And incline your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel. It is obvious, therefore, that while the truth is that there is no other God before me, this is the truth of monotheism. This is the truth they've heard preached in the valleys of Moab, right outside Jericho, beyond the Jordan, by Moses. While they heard this truth, the Israelites continued to maintain alternatives to God. They continue their idolatry, just in case there's another God stronger than Yahweh. And they hesitated to enter the land initially because they entertained the possibility that someone other than their God may prove stronger. So theomachy continues to be the framework within which they are thinking. Now we know there's no theomachy, but their framework is the framework of Ur, still, of Mesopotamia. Therefore, if that is the framework of their thought, then God has to act within that framework that they are able to grasp in order to bring them out of it. What I mean is, to arrive at the ultimate truth that there are no other gods, the Israelites have to experience within their framework the death of these other gods. In heaven, only one God rules. But in their human vision, the reality that has appeared to them as true in their context is that many gods rule, and we are not really sure who will win at the end. So I want us to understand this tension that's going on in the Bible. Because you may see texts that are these divine truths, these diachronic truths, these eternal truths that run through the canon. But you also see how people are taught in the scripture through their own language and through their own framework. Now, let's remember for a second the battle between Baal and Yahweh on Mount Carmel that Elijah presided over. Okay, we know there is one God. Elijah knows there is one God, okay? So there were true monotheists in Israel. And that there is no chance in the world that Baal will win this battle and defeat Yahweh. However, the Israelites, who have fell into the trap of Baal worship in the land of Israel, are still not sure. A battle has to be orchestrated before their very eyes in order for God to demonstrate in history, in their experience, the eternal truths of monotheism. So it has to translate into history. And how will it translate into history? Through a battle. But we know it's a sham battle, right? Okay, so Israelites have to grow into these truths. They have to experience them in action. For this reason, Elijah stages a competition between Baal and Yahweh. And his characteristic question that he poses to the people is, how long will you go limping with two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. What he does is to call the prophets of Baal and ask them to bring their own offering to their God, a bull, and prepare it for sacrifice on the altar. He does the same for Yahweh with another bull. And then both of them are to call upon their God, and the God who responds by fire would prove to be the true God. Everyone accepts. So, let's see if I put the story. No, I will read it to you. So they took the bull that was given them, prepared it, and called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, crying, "Oh, Baal, answer us!" But there was no voice and no answer. They limped about the altar that they had made. At noon, Elijah mocked them, saying, "Cry aloud, surely he is a god. Either he's meditating, or he has wandered away, or he's on a journey, or perhaps he's asleep and must be awakened." And then they cried aloud. Actually, they believed him. They cried aloud, and as was their custom, they cut themselves with swords and lances until the blood gushed out over them, probably to incite the pity of their God. As midday passed, they raved on until the time of the offering of the oblation, but there was no voice, no answer, and no response. So you can see that Elijah represents the truth that is yet unknown, not only to the prophets of Baal, who continue their shouting, but to the watching Israelites as well. So Elijah continues, demonstrating that not only is Baal not a match for Yahweh, but no single element of nature can resist his ultimate power. So water cannot quench the consuming fire of Yahweh. He builds the broken altar of Yahweh, and he prepares the offering on it. He flooded the altar with water 3 times, including the trench he had dug around the altar, which was now full, and called the people to come closer for the prayer and to witness God themselves. I'm reading, at the time of the offering of the oblation, the prophet Elijah came near and said, "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and I'm your servant, and that I have done all these things at your bidding. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, so that these people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back." Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the stones, and the dust, and even licked up the water that was in the trench. When all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and said, "The Lord indeed is God. The Lord indeed is God." And here the Lord read Yahweh. They said, "Yahweh is God. Yahweh is God." Was this a real competition? Did God need to defeat Baal in actuality on the same level? Was there a real threat to Yahweh? No. But the battle was necessary for the people to experience the superiority of Yahweh in their own terms, to be educated out of polytheism and into monotheism. Even though there's a problem with these terms, I don't like them, polytheism, monotheism, and we can discuss later on in the questions, if you like, about them. They nevertheless serve our purpose for now. In a polytheistic framework of understanding, a staged theomachy is the only way for people to grasp the superiority of Yahweh. Many people now refer to the Harem type of war as holy war. This is how they usually translate it or use this terminology. But this terminology does not exist in the Bible. There is no description of holy war in the Bible. These are terms borrowed by various scholars from discussions concerning Islamic jihad. Traditionally, jihad aims at the conversion of non-Muslims, often through violence and imposition of taxes. Now, I'm not an expert in this, and you can correct me anytime. But jihad is considered to be a religious duty for the Muslims, even though there's more modern or liberal versions of jihad that restrict it only to defensive rather than offensive wars. Now, a scholar named Schwally was the first to borrow this terminology because he considered the wars of Israel to be part of their worship, to be a cultic practice, just like their sacrifices. So he confused the fact that Harem is used in the sacrificial system, and he thought, oh, these battles must also be a form of worship, a form of sacrifice to their God. But it's wrong. Modern research has shown that the battles of Israel were not considered to be a worship of theirs. They were considered to be the battles of Yahweh. It was his battles. It was not the people doing something for God. The people were not protecting Yahweh or his worship, but instead it was usually Yahweh who was coming to battle in order to defend his people. Therefore, it is better to call, and preferable to call these wars the wars of Yahweh rather than holy wars, so that we are not giving a false anachronistic understanding that here we have something similar to jihad. We have to be careful on this. These wars did not serve any of the purposes that jihad has. Now, this is actually what is used in the Bible. Yahweh's war of Yahweh. This terminology, war of Yahweh, is more biblical, and it occurs many times in the biblical text. Numbers 21:14, 1 Samuel, Exodus, various places. And Yahweh is described as a warrior or the angel of the Lord, and is described that way, as a warrior angel of the Lord that goes into battle. So again, it's not a worship. Especially in the book of Deuteronomy, we see this description at the end of the book. Let's have a look at, okay, here you can see the various references where war of Yahweh and Yahweh as warrior appears. So Deuteronomy 32 says, "See now that I, even I, am he. There is no God besides me. I kill and I make alive. I wound and I heal, and no one can deliver from my hand. For I lift up my hand to heaven and swear, as I live forever, when I whet my flashing sword, and my hand takes hold on judgment, I will take vengeance on my adversaries, and will repay those who hate me. I will make my arrows drunk with blood, and my sword shall devour flesh with the blood of the slain and the captives from the long-haired enemy." Now you see, he's speaking of these wars as his own wars. It's not the people's wars. And the same is true in various battles. Yahweh seems to be the one who fights. Deuteronomy 1:30, "The Lord your God who goes before you is the one who will fight for you, just as he did for you in Egypt before your very eyes." What were they doing in Egypt? They were just sitting inside the houses behind the blood-stained doorposts, exactly. And he was the one who was doing battle in the night for them. It's his wars. Now, the emphasis of the war, therefore, is placed on Yahweh's initiative rather than the military skills of Israel. Now, we already saw that in the ancient Near East, it was the king who had the initiative and led the people into battle in order to win the victory for them. But in the case of Israel, Yahweh is not only Israel's God, but he's also in the role of their sovereign king. He was the one deciding which wars to fight, and he was the one to lead his people into them. So he goes ahead of them. This is why later, during Samuel's reign, if you remember, during Samuel's leadership, when the people ask for a king, they say they want a king to go out before them and fight their battles. This is in 1 Samuel 8. Yahweh confirms to Samuel that it was God himself that the people rejected. But they're asking for a king. God took it as a rejection. This means that he was their king. Yahweh was their king. They didn't need another king to lead them into battle. He was doing that for them. And that's why he says in 1 Samuel 8:7, listen to the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. He is the king of Israel, no human king. Now, Yahweh was the one leading Israel's battles, and they should never misunderstand this or attribute a victory to a human king. And perhaps this was the reason that it was forbidden for the human king, whenever Israel decided to appoint one, it was forbidden for him to multiply horses for himself or to buy any of them from Egypt, because it was horses that carried the royal chariot into battle. Note Deuteronomy 17. Even so, he must not acquire many horses. If you ever decide to have a king, he must not acquire many horses for himself or return the people to Egypt in order to acquire more horses, since the Lord has said to you, you must never return that way. Okay, so no horses for the king. Why? Well, the majority of iconographic representations from Egypt and Assyrian wars portray the king on a chariot pulled by horses as he fights against his enemies. It must have been the case that God did not want to give the impression that the one who has the horses, the king, that is the one who is carrying out the battle for Israel. This misunderstanding must never be made. So it's noteworthy, not only that he forbids horses for the king, but it's noteworthy that there is no military iconography in the Israelite temple anywhere. And it was not supposed to be built by one associated with war. You remember that David was rejected as a candidate for building the temple because he shed blood in war, and that disqualifies him. Okay? No one should give the impression that the victories of Yahweh are achieved on the basis of military. They are his wars. Also, the king who is leading the people into battle dwelled in the midst of the army camp in a tent usually. Now, the similarities of the tabernacle of Yahweh and the military tent of Ramses II, when he was out to battle against the Hittites in Kadesh, is striking. The tent of Ramses II, he is portraying this tabernacle in his battle against the Hittites in Kadesh. And you will see this in Abu Simbel, it's in Luxor, and it's in other places as well. But note the parallels with the tabernacle of Yahweh. Both structures have rectilinear courtyards with lines running down, oriented to the east. So you see where the doors are, the openings. They are twice as long as they are wide. The entrance is in the center of the eastern short wall. In the camp's middle is the entrance to a 3-to-1 long room. I do have a laser thing. Okay, so you see, this is longer than the width. You see this structure, which is 3-to-1 structure, a long room tent, and it's composed of a 2-to-1 reception tent leading to a square room. This is a cube. It's a square room, which is the throne. And alternatively is labeled Pharaoh's chamber or the Holy of Holies for the tabernacle. Let's see more representations of this. Here is Ramses II military camp at Kadesh. This is in the Ramseum. So you see this structure. Sometimes it's simpler, sometimes it's more elaborate. Here are the tents of his 3 sons. Here you get a fuller representation of the tent. And also here you can see the throne room. Right here. And it's a copy of this one. So, what does God communicate by having a tent like this one in the middle of the camp of his people? What God communicates by this structure, which is already familiar to the Israelites from their Egyptian experience, is that the Israelites do not have a mere human king in their midst leading them to battle. But they have the God of the universe himself in this cube, in this Holy of Holies, in their midst. They don't have Ramses II sitting in the Holy of Holies. They don't have Moses sitting there. They don't have Joshua who led them to battle. They don't have Samuel. They don't have David sitting in there or any other human king. Who sits in that cube in the case of Israel? The presence of the Creator God himself, who moves along with his people in the desert, in their journey against all enemies, and he's the one who fights their battles. It could not be communicated in any more ways. God took on all the iconography, all the concepts, all the metaphors that they could possibly have in their mind to communicate this truth. I am your king. I will be fighting your battles. Trust in military power is thus downplayed, and absolute allegiance to the one true God is the key to life. Now we have a similar downplay of military power also in chapter 20 of Deuteronomy as well. In verse 4, Yahweh tells them, no, I have not put a PowerPoint on this, sorry. He says them, for it is the Lord your God who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies, to give you victory. And after this statement, he offers them a whole lot of reasons for which someone should stay at home and not go to war. You would think that he would want to recruit as many people as possible to go to war to secure the victory against the Canaanites. But no, right after the instructions of war, right after he says, I'm the one who's leading, he gives them the reasons to stay home. What are the reasons for someone not to go to war? Is a new house, if he has just acquired a new house, if he has a new vineyard, if he just got married, if he's in a new wedding, or if he fears war. If this person is feeling afraid, God understands that you fear and you cannot handle this, so just stay at home. Don't make this fear contagious to the whole camp. Stay at home. So chapter 25-8 gives you a whole lot of reasons to stay at home. And this list, what does this list show? Well, first of all, it shows that God is not dependent on you to win his victory. You can stay home and he will still do it. But this list shows a certain reverence for life and its enjoyment. But it also shows something else. It shows that the bigger the number of people that goes into war, the greater the chances are that they will not attribute their victory to God's power. And God does something similar with Gideon in Judges 7. You remember the case where the Lord said to Gideon, the troops with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand. Israel would only take the credit away from me, saying, my own hand has delivered me. Now, therefore, proclaim this in the hearing of the troops. Whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home. Thus Gideon sifted them out, 22,000 returned, and 10,000 remained. And you remember that even the simple numbering of the army, the census, was considered a sin since it demonstrated a dependence on the number of soldiers. Let's look at 2 Samuel 24:10. But afterward, David was stricken to the heart because he had numbered the people. David said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. But now, O Lord, I pray you, take away the guilt of your servant, for I have done very foolishly. Censuses are a scary thing. Remember, we spoke about censuses in the wars in the ancient Near East, and it was a ritual, it was a magical thing of partaking of a ritual meal together and preparing ritually for war. They were a scary thing, but I have a friend, another Old Testament scholar called George Athens, and he says that censuses basically put a claim of ownership over the people and their assets by the registering authority. The basic thought is, if I have counted you, I own you and your assets, and can call on you and your assets at my will. Therefore, David's census was a bad thing to do because it was asserting his right to ownership over Israel when the national covenant stipulated that Israel actually belonged to God. Again, the mistake is made that David is king of Israel. No, God is king of Israel. And David is just an appointed mini king next to him. He's not the real king. So, in some way, attributing word to God meant, paradoxically, that you had to restrict militarism in Israel.